I want each of my panelists to begin by introducing themselves, and then we're going to have some discussion and conversation. But we're going to go alphabetical by last names. So we'll start with Mauro.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mauro Javier Cárdenas. I was born and raised in Guayaquil, Ecuador. It's really hot and humid and horrible. I write in English. My first novel came out in September. Even though I grew up surrounded by Spanish. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, I just wanted to mention, Mauro, are you not one of the new Hay Festival Latin American authors? Okay, yeah, congratulations on that. That's a wonderful honor.
I'm Enrique Chagoya. I'm an artist. I focus on painting, drawing, printmaking. I make a lot of books, hand-painted books, lithographic books, inspired by pre-Columbian books that have a different kinds of visual writing. So I was invited to make a series of drawings for the novel for Pedro Páramo by Arion Press last year, and I was very lucky to do that. So I did a series of drawings. They are not illustrations of the book because I don't think Pedro Páramo needs any illustrations, but rather they are parallel stories. And I'll talk more about it when it's my turn. And in the meantime, thank you for having me here. It's a privilege.
Hello, my name is Cristina Rivera Garza. I'm a Mexican writer. I'm also a professor at the University of Houston, where we are launching our first PhD in Hispanic Studies with a concentration in creative writing in Spanish. It's the first in the nation, so I'm very happy about that. My most recent, thank you. My most recent work is a book precisely around or through the work of Juan Rulfo. I'm investigating there the relationship between what happens in regards to the making of a life and the writing of a life. I'm trying to see how many bridges are there in between these two. I've been living in this country for too many years, and happy to be here.
Guadalupe.
Hi, everyone. My name is Guadalupe Nettel. I'm a fiction author. I was born and raised in Mexico, and I live there. So two of my more recent books are translated into English. One is Natural Histories and The Body Where I Was Born. Both are published by Seven Stories Press in New York. I am also the editor of this magazine that you have, that the UNAM, Autonomous University of Mexico, published, and this is our special issue on Juan Rulfo. Thank you.
All right.
Hello.
We just came over from a 10 o'clock panel, so she's doing double duty this morning.
Sorry for that. Excuse my pronunciation, but this is the second time I am speaking English in front of all people. So, my name is Aura Shilonen. It means, in Nahuatl, goddess of the sweet corn. I am Mexican and I am a writer, but I love cinema, so I want to be a filmmaker, but in Mexico it's very expensive. So, yeah. I entered to a contest 2 years ago, and my book won prize, Mauricio Chair. So Cristina was one of the jurors in that contest, and now my book is being translated to seven languages. So since that moment, everything has been vertiginous. And I am so happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's an honor for me. Thank you.
Thank you. I forgot to mention, my name is Jane Ciabattari. I'm here in multiple capacities. I'm on the Bay Area Book Festival's Program Steering Committee, which gives me a great pleasure to be part of this wonderful group in its third year. I'm also a columnist for BBC culture on a global level. And I chose Juan Rulfo's second novel, The Golden Cockerel, as one of the books to read in 2017 for my global audience. I'm also a former president and a current vice president of the National Book Critics Circle. It's an organization that's based in New York, but it's national, and our awards go to authors translated in English, but internationals. And our awards have gone to Borges and Bolaño and others who are writing in Spanish as a first language, but are translated into English. I also speak to you as a person who's a believer in language. I believe in the power of language to change the world we live in and to give people understanding of each other. And that's why Juan Rulfo speaks to me. As I read Pedro Páramo again for the maybe third time this week, I was on a phone reading this the other night. It took me into a world where language was clear, crystalline, easy to follow, and the world began to change around me, and I slid into that world that he created so easily that I want to begin by reading to you a few paragraphs of that wonderful book, Pedro Páramo. I came to Comala because I was told that my father, a man called Pedro Paramo, was living there. It was what my mother had told me, and I promised I would go and see him after she died. I assured her I would do that. She was near death, and I would have promised her anything. Don't fail to go and see him, she told me. That's what his name is, although they sometimes call him something else. I am sure he would want to know you. The only thing I could do was to tell her I would do it, and after saying it so often, it became such a habit that I continued repeating it even after I managed to remove my hands from her lifeless hands. Before she died, she also told me, when you go, don't ask him for anything. Demand that he give you what is ours, what he should have given us and never did. Make him pay dearly, my son, for the way he has neglected us. Yes, I'll do that, Mother. I never really intended to fulfill my promise, but now I have started to just dream about it and to be filled with illusions. After that, a new world began to take shape based on the hope of a man called Pedro Páramo, the husband of my mother, and that's why I came to Comala. So, with the classic timely opening like that, we enter the world that Juan Rulfo created. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to say, when did you first read Juan Rulfo? What was the book? What was the story? And what was your reaction? Jump in, whoever wants to go first. No alphabetical. What do you think?
So I first read Juan Rulfo when I was a teenager, like between 13 and 14 years old. The Spanish professor recommended it, and I didn't want to read it because of that. So one day she came up into the classroom and said, you don't have to read Rulfo anymore because some parents have complained about the immorality, and they thought that it was not appropriated for teenagers. So I ran into my house and looked for the book. And that's how I began to read Juan Rulfo, because it was forbidden. A forbidden book has to be read immediately. So I started with El Llano en Llamas, which is a short story collection, and I started reading the story of a little boy, or even almost a teenager, called Macario, who lives with his godmother in the countryside. He's a peasant, and he's waiting for the frogs to appear and just kill them to eat. So he's got semi-erotic relationship with his wet mother. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, this is amazing, because the author was speaking at the first person with the voice of the peasants that I've heard sometimes when I occasionally go to the countryside. But he was speaking about the neglected condition of children in the countryside, about the poverty, about the marginalized condition of them. So a lot of things that I've heard, I've seen, I've mostly seen and had an intuition about it, but nobody wanted to speak in Mexico, because you have to know that in Mexico there is an abyss between urban and rural world. So the second one, the rural world, doesn't have a voice. They live like totally marginalized, and it's like they don't have a place in Mexican society. So this is very important to understand the context of this work. And at that age, I felt like somebody was finally speaking about that, but with words, so simple words and beautiful words that even a teenager could perfectly understand. And he was not like complaining or doing very evident social criticism, but talking as the more natural thing in the world, like the everyday life of a peasant there. And finally, I felt that somebody had spoken about that. And it was very powerful and beautiful too, because it has lots of really simple metaphors, and the context is really strong, the context behind. So that was my first impression on Juan Rulfo.
So I didn't read Juan Rulfo until very late in life. And I want to tell you a little bit why. So I grew up in Guayaquil, and I went to a Catholic middle school and high school where there were 3 tracks. You had to choose physics and math, chemistry, and then there was a literature one. But they had eliminated the literature one because it was not useful anymore for being a human being. So we didn't really have literature. I barely read any of the sort of classics. I didn't know Juan Rulfo was a classic at all. How I found out about it was, years passed. I came here. I didn't know what to do with my life. I thought maybe I'll become a writer. And I did what most writers do, at least the ones that I've met, is that you start trying to read everything. And you read a lot of these books about how to learn how to read like a writer, or how to all those sort of how-to books. And I was reading one that is actually quite good by Francine Prose. And towards the end of the book, she talks about Pedro Páramo. And she actually this is a book about how to read like a writer, right? And I just reread it this morning, and it's funny because the example she gives is like, here's an example of what literature should be, and there's nothing you can learn from it, because it's you shouldn't do what he's doing, basically. It's there's really nothing to learn other than like literature is difficult, so of course I went and bought it right away and read it and loved it, and years went by and actually met Francine Prose at some writer's thing, and I talked to her about her little essay about Pedro Paramo, and she's very nice, and she asked me like, do you think that the character, when he arrives to Comala, that he's dead or alive? And I was like, what? What are you talking about? So I went back and reread it, and I don't know the answer to that question.
I grew up also in Mexico City, and I have a very similar experience than yours. Aira? Guadalupe. Yeah, sorry. I also was asked to read the book when I was in secondary school. I think I was probably around 14 years old. And I remember reading it and totally went blank in my mind. I didn't understand it. It was something like maybe a Mexican movie with ghosts or whatever. I wrote something about it. I don't even remember what I wrote about it. And it was not until last year when I was asked to see if I would like to work on a book here in San Francisco by Juan Rulfo, Pedro Paramo, that I read it again, and it blew my mind. I thought, how come I just missed this? It was an amazing. I read it both in English and Spanish. And to me, the story struck a very interesting chord about the concept in Mexico that is very rooted since pre-Columbian times of life and death. It's fairly different than the European, than the Spaniards. In terms of, like what you see on Day of the Dead is just like the tip of the concept. The idea that life was like a dream, this is according to some poetry that a Nahua specialist translated. It says that life is a dream, and then you wake up. And this is rescued by Miguel León Portilla, who's a Mexican really one of the best writers on Nahua culture, in a book of Mexican songs that he wrote. So, life is a dream, then you wake up. In case it's a whole concept, very different than the Spanish life is a dream, and dreams only dreams are. That's by I believe Calderón de la Barca. So it sounds like almost the same, but it's not quite the same. When life is a dream, you study that means that reality is not that real, and when you die, your life begins. That's when people actually make celebrations, especially in the countryside. And there was no idea of hell. There's always like 13 heavens where people went to. And because of that, there were celebrations anytime that somebody died. That doesn't mean people were not sad of losing their relatives or friends or people they love, but there was a concept that they always went to heaven, and there was life began. That concept is very rooted in a lot of graphics. People like Posada, for instance, it's, where all the skeletons are having a life, they are dancing. But there was like, the very first maybe example of this was a book censored by the Holy Inquisition. It was The Portentous Life of Death, La Portentosa Vida de la Muerte, in which death has a life from birth to death. There's the cradle of death, the little baby, the skeleton. Okay, so yes, and the only thing I wanted to say, Juan Rulfo's concept of life and death is not different than this, because there is no border between the living and the dead. And the dead are alive, the ones who are alive might be dead, and that it's what I just wanted to say with that point. And I needed to illustrate the Precolumbian.
Yeah, that's the feeling you get.
All right. Well, I have always said that I owe my relationship to Juan Rulfo to the public education policies in Mexico. I grew up in the very latter part of the 20th century when the Mexican state was still interested in supporting public schools, and I attended public schools. So I do believe that book, Pedro Páramo, was first assigned to me in a public school. But now that I heard your story, I don't know if it was actually assigned by a professor or a professor just recommended it to me. I'm gonna be thinking about that more closely after listening to your story. But in any case, I met Rulfo right there when I was also very young. All of us were reading, and in my case, it was Pedro Páramo, the first one. It was a huge event, a shocking event in my life. I knew something important had happened to me. I didn't know exactly what had happened, and it seems to me that it's taken me all these many years after that first contact, just to try to figure out what happened. I knew it was something of extreme beauty. It was something extremely moving. It was something that was destined to be part of my life. But I didn't know, I didn't have the language or the concepts that I was going to need later in life just to try to explain what was that exactly, what had happened to me. It was like being through an accident and having survived a massive accident and just trying to figure out what happened on the road. But of all the many stories, of all the many plots and subplots in Pedro Páramo, it seems to me that the one that hit me first was mostly the love story. I mean, that tremendously tragic, melancholy love story between this very powerful man, Pedro Páramo, and the woman that did not love him back. It was that contradiction, that paradox between someone who was able to achieve whatever he wanted to, and yet was totally unable to get the love that he wanted the most. It is the great unloved one. That's how I've been calling him later. I was when I was reading all these. I grew up in northern Mexico, not in central Mexico. I'm part of a family with a long tradition of migration between Mexico and the United States. And so what was very interesting to me is that even though I read him, it must have been either in Chihuahua or in Tamaulipas, I'm not so sure at this point now, but even though the landscape is so different, even though the social groups that inhabit this area of Mexico are quite different than those in Mesoamerica, more in the south, it didn't matter. There was a very deep connection to what it meant to us, even though we were migrants, even though we were moving from one place to another. There was something at its core, palpitating, something that was truly relevant, to recognize ourselves as part of something that was larger and that was not only outside of us, but it was deep within us as members of a family, as members of a community. And I think that's what I keep with me after all these many years, that basic knowledge that I keep with me after all these many years with Pedro Paramo and Juan Rulfo.
Okay. Well, everybody in my home said Pedro Páramo is an amazing book, and Juan Rulfo also is wonderful. So, as I always been a very curious girl and metiche, no sé cómo traducir eso. I start reading it, and I am not going to tell you the first thought I have, because surely my first text of Rulfo must be disaster. I don't know, because in the first thing I didn't understand anything, but for the second reading I said, okay, all right, the words are a little revolts, and for the third, my third impression was the transparent clarity of words metaphorize forever a piece of heat called Comala. So that was my impression. Of course, it took like 2 or 3 years to get to that impression.
Thank you, guys. Enrique, I really appreciated your explanation of the world of Juan Rulfo and how it goes back to pre-Columbian work. I didn't want to cut you off, but we have so little time. We could talk for hours, I think. We have so many places to go. But thank you for that. Since you mentioned it, Aura, how many of you have been to Comala? How many of you have been to Comala? Have you been to Comala?
No.
No?
I never.
Alejandro was born in Comala. Okay. Have you been into Juan Rulfo territory? Christina. Tell us about your recent experience.
Well, this is not Comala, the place that Rulfo makes a reference to in Pedro Páramo. But there is another wonderful story in Allán en Llamas at the Burning Plains. The title of this short story is Luvina, precisely. And for a long time, I believe, as pretty much everybody in Mexico, that Luvina was located either in Jalisco, where Juan Rulfo was born, or in Colima, where Comala is located. And it took me some years and a lot of conversations with people from Oaxaca, and I bet many of you are familiar with this most wonderful state in Mexico, in southern Mexico. Great social diversity and linguistic diversity as well in this place. So it turns out that Luvina, in fact, is a little Zapotec town up in the highlands of Oaxaca. I was, some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I was teaching a writing workshop in Oaxaca, and I invited some of my students to actually take the road and visit this little Zapotec town We did so on several weekends, and we learned that people from Luvina were, in fact, good readers of the short story, and that they had their own opinions about what Luvina meant and how they are described in this story. As it turns out, people who are described in certain ways are not always in agreement with the author who describes them in those ways. Luvina, in the short story, Juan Rulfo describes Luvina as the people of Luvina as people who do not know how to smile. And from the very first time that I got there, I did very much as the author of the short story does, which is I went to the main church and I waited there to meet people. And one of these, a woman, in fact, was very curious about our presence there. And she's like, "What are you doing here?" And I was very sincere. I said, "Well, I'm following on the steps of Juan Rulfo here in Luvina." And he said, So we started talking, and after she was more at ease with the conversation at the very end, she said, "Well, please, you go and tell this Juan Rulfo that here in Luvina, we know how to smile." So that was a really nice story, because she transformed me in a kind of a messenger in between worlds. And so now I'm giving you the message that Luvina is a place in which people actually do smile. And I just visited the place precisely on May the 15th to celebrate the birthday of Juan Rulfo. It is very important to me to say that this is a celebration that was totally organized and financed by the people of Luvina. There were no other political institutions involved in the organization. People from Luvina wanted to throw a massive, wonderful party, mole included, for this celebration. They had to take a vote in the assembly, local form of authority, just to make sure that everybody was in agreement, because once they had agreed on this event, they all had to participate either with resources or with labor. So they all had to be they were going to enter into a collaborative way of cultural organization. So we were there. I presented a book, the book that I referred to earlier, about Juan Rulfo, and it was just magical and wonderful, and people were extremely generous, and I was just so taken by the fact that up there in this community, right in the highlands of Oaxaca, people were discussing with great depth and a lot of love about one of the most important writers in Mexican literary history. And I think that's a massive thank you of a whole nation for the work and the writings of this Juan Rulfo.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to ask each of you to address the question of how Juan Rulfo's work as a photographer and as a filmmaker might have affected the way in which he told his stories. And you might want, if you care to weave in how it might have affected your own work as you began to move into your role as an artist and writer. So jump in when you're ready.
Lights.
Right.
So I can speak about the concrete way that Pedro Paramo. My first novel, it took a very long time to write, partly because of questions like the following, which is, in my mind, I was trying to write a novel that combined, this is very absurd, but this is what you do, right? It's like, I want the intimacy of a novel like Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald, but I also want the expansiveness of 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, and I didn't know how to go about it, obviously because it was a ridiculous idea. But I was rereading Pedro Páramo, and there was a very small line, where he talks about it goes, and I wrote it down: ruidos, rumores, voces, canciones lejanas. So that was in the back of my mind that you could actually write a novel where there were just these voices that didn't necessarily have to be characters, right? In the traditional sense of a character that has all these emotions and looks like this, but that you could actually write a novel where you have voices surrounding the place. So, in fact, I had a chapter in my first book that was called Voices, Noises, Rumors. And actually, I had forgotten that that this came from Pedro Paramo until I reread it years later. I was like, oh yeah, that's where it came from. So yeah, that's the same thing.
All right. You're a filmmaker and a writer.
Well, I am studying for be a filmmaker, so I need the money, but in the future maybe I will.
Well, that's part of Juan Rulfo's story, is it not?
Yeah. I always think that all the Mexican writers are children of Pedro Páramo. So I think, like in genetics, the DNA of words can sip the work of so many authors. So for my book, I was trying to do this amazing metaphors. So, but yeah, Juan Rulfo influenced me a lot, because every year that I read the book, my mind changed. So maybe when I have 30 years, it will keep changing. So I also believe, like, cinema. The cinema is an image, and literature they are words, and with words we make image. So I think that who does not have the ability to visualize what he writes or she writes, they will write only discolored words. So that's, I don't know, with that I wanted to say that. Cinema. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I love that idea.
Really?
Yeah. All the hours of the day.
Let me see. I tend to think that influence is a question better answered by the readers than by authors themselves. I mean, I really think, I'd love to think that my work has been influenced by my many readings of Juan Rulfo, but that's something that I don't get to decide, right? But, well, I can tell you what has been important to me, what the kinds of things that I've been thinking about when I read Rulfo. It has to do mostly with the structure. It's a fragmentary structure, the downplaying of plot. I don't think that Rulfo was that interested in plot, is precisely what you were mentioning. The issue, I think he has a very good ear, and dialogues are really captivating. And I think if we come to think that the narrative, one of the definitions in any case, is the development of meaning over time, I think it's way more interesting in meaning over time rather than on development as such. And I think this is a point where the words link very nicely to the photographs. So here we have these kind of snapshots, these fragments that are connected somehow, but it is our work, the implication of the reader, that is going to be actually connecting these fragments. And I think it's that invitation, that very open invitation for the reader to do the connection, to do the linking of all these many pieces that has kept me coming back to Rulfo again and again.
I think that's something interesting in Rulfo's work, is that the landscape becomes a character, a major character of the work. So that's something that he left me. So he describes rain and describes the land, this dry land of Jalisco, as a dry piece of cow skin. And it's really visual what he's saying. We see the landscape of this dry land for kilometers and kilometers, or miles, as you say. And so also the architecture and the non-architecture, the lack of urbanity, and I think it's what we find also in some of his photographs. At least it's what has more impacted me.
Yes, I'll be brief. But, anyway, the novel is extremely visual. I mean, it's like you're seeing a movie. I haven't seen the movie, by the way. I would love to see the movie with the same title. But to me, there is no. It's like a non-linear narrative, which I love because you can interpret many things out of it. And I do books like that. So what I did for a letterpress version of Llano en Llamas was images of ghosts that are alive and dead at the same time. And I had to think of a concept that will resemble that. Again, they are not illustrations of the novel, but they are based on that concept. So I started with some cover drawings. It's hard to see because you're welcome to see this book outside. There is a table with the actual book and a print. And I studied Mexican portraiture from the times of the novel, from around the turn of the century and early Mexican 20th century. So I did ghostly illustrations. I'm going to show you some of them. From inspired by some photography and paintings by Hermenegildo Bustos, a Mexican painter. And from one side you see the figure, and the other side of the page you see the ghost. And at some point they are alive, but you turn the page and they are dead. And so, same thing here. I did another one. I had 10 drawings. I won't have time to show you all of them, but I mean, same thing with this lady. So here you could see her, and the door behind her is a ghost. So the house is like a ghost, but you turn the page, and then she's gone, and the house is there. So I did quite a few. I was inspired by one of the love figures, the love of the life of one of the characters. I don't want to tell you the plot, or you probably read it, but so she's a ghost on a landscape, and I agree the landscape is a very important element in this novel. So I did a volcano in the background, and this young woman coming out of it. So, in this case, a father and a son with a pre-Columbian map in the back. Here you can see the pre-Columbian map and the ghost of the character. Anyway, so you could see the whole book. This is like a couple of farm workers, where the face is invisible on the front, and then on the back, the faces are there, but the body is gone. It reminds me of a scene where two lovers are talking underground and they hear steps, and you realize they are dead, but they're still together, embracing. Anyway, so this was a great inspiration for me, just to reread the novel and rediscover it again. I keep reading it, and that's all I have to say. So I'll be glad to talk more about the book, maybe outside. And there is also a print I did of Nahui Olin, who was this artist too, from around the same time, with the same idea of a ghost.
Bravo. Thank you so much. And also, Guadalupe, you have a special issue of your magazine that has been handed out. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, so this is my first issue as the director of this magazine, and I had to do something on Rulfo's work because it was not only the 100th birthday of him, but also because I really thought that it was important to make an homage, to pay homage to this author, which is not only an important author, but also very loved, as Cristina was saying. He's loved in all Mexico. Why? I think that probably because he was the first one that really gave a voice to these people without a voice. And also because we feel that this world, the rural world, is very much connected to all of us, and he was like giving light or enlightening a part of us who was always silent and dark. So what we decided, because I'm not myself the only one who takes decisions, we are a team, so we decided that we wanted to have Rulfo's contemporary authors and writers who knew him very well, as Fernando del Paso or Elena Poniatowska, and also some others like Nicanor Parra, who is from Chile but had read him and had a very beautiful interpretation of his work. But also young writers that never met him, but were explaining how they discovered him and what we are doing now. So there is also an architect who speak about the landscape and the architecture in the area where Rulfo is born, and we have a photographer Paulina Lavista, who met him actually because she was married to another writer, Salvador Elizondo, who was a friend of Rulfo, and we have a graphic reportage here that shows for the first time the diaries of Salvador Elizondo and the drawings he made there. Some of them are inspired by El Llano en Llamas and the landscapes of Rulfo. All of this is Salvador Elizondo's drawings on Juan Rulfo's work, as you can see. So there is a text here that Luciano Concheiro, a Mexican writer, very young, he's 24 years old, wrote about Elizondo's drawing, and it's called Las Equivocaciones de Elizondo, which is on the artist vocation, is that? So the artistic vocation, and how when you are an artist, like for instance Enrique, you don't only have a domain or a field where you can express. Rulfo was an amazing writer, but he was also an amazing photographer, and he was also a filmmaker, very good man. So Luciano Concheiro explains how this artistic vocation can go in many, many directions, and not only in one field as we are used to think. So all of this, we have also a special part where many different authors of different ages are speaking about Rulfo and giving his interpretation, Rulfo as a character. So, like Mario Belatin or Juan Pablo Villalobos, and many Mexican writers publish here like very short text making of Rulfo a character, because we believe that when you read an author, as we have read Juan Rulfo, you appropriate him, like if he becomes a part of you. It's a kind of cannibalism, actually, reading. So we wanted to express that, and we also invited some graphic artists, like illustrators, that make Rulfo part of their work, and they also cannibalize him. So as you can see here. So that was our intent on this issue.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that the Lit Hub, which is a publication that's online, and I'm one of their columnists, devoted a long story on Juan Rulfo's birthday to his work, and has contributions from Colin Villosa and from Douglas Weatherford, who's the translator of the new book, Deep Vellum, published this year, The Golden Cockerel, and also Yuri Herrera, who makes a comment that his characters and stories are not dated, but in fact function as a metonymy of Mexico and of the universal tragedy that art endeavors to illuminate. I'm hoping this will work, but I've asked each of our panelists to bring in a favorite sentence or paragraph and read it in English and Spanish as a kind of ending moment, so we have the voices again and Juan Rulfo's work again, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Did you bring some? Okay, right here.
Okay. I guess the thing I have both English and Spanish. I'm going to read the last some of the last words in the book. You read some of the beginning. So. Allá atrás, Pedro Páramo, sentado en su equipal, miró el cortejo que se iba hacia el pueblo. Sintió que su mano izquierda, al querer levantarse, caía muerta sobre sus rodillas. Pero no hizo caso de eso. Estaba acostumbrado a ver morir cada día alguno de sus pedazos. Pedro Paramo was sitting in an old chair beside the main door of the Media Luna, a little before the last shadow of night slipped away. He had been there alone for about 3 hours. Oh, sorry, no. That was the wrong. Oh, sorry. Behind them, still in his chair, Pedro Páramo watched the procession making its way back to the village as he tried. As he tried to lift his left hand, it dropped. Oh, yeah, this is it. As he tried to lift his left hand, it dropped like lead to his knees. But he thought nothing of it. He was used to seeing some part of him die every day. He watched the leaves falling from the paradise tree. They all follow the same road. They all go away. Then he returned to where he had left his thoughts.
Anyone else? Laura?
Yeah. Now that Mexico is plunged into a violence and corruption, I want to tell you that we must read in these days, so faithful, Diles que no me maten, which is an extraordinary story and can be applied to our contemporary reality. So I will read it. Diles que no me maten, Justino. Anda, ve a decirles eso, que por caridad, así diles. Diles que lo hagan por caridad. No puedo. Hay ahí un sargento que no quiere oír nada de ti. Haz que te oiga. Date tus mañas y dile que por sustos ya ha estado bueno. Dile que lo haga por caridad de Dios. No se trata de sustos. Parece que te van a matar de a de veras. Y yo ya no quiero volver allá. Anda otra vez, solamente otra vez, a ver qué consigues. No, no tengo ganas de ir. Según eso, yo soy tu hijo. Y si voy mucho con ellos, acabarán por saber quién soy y les dará por afusilarme a mí también. Es mejor dejar las cosas de este tamaño. Anda, Justino. Diles que tengan tantita lástima de mí. No más eso diles.
Y bueno.
So I love this passage, and it's probably because in my mind I'm still like a 11-year-old boy. But there's basically the son of Pedro Páramo is arriving, and he runs into apparently one of his brothers. That's son of Pedro Páramo. So that they're just chatting up, and the brother is talking. And he's saying, el caso es que nuestras madres nos malparieron en un petate aunque éramos hijos de Pedro Páramo. Y lo más chistoso es que él nos llevó a bautizar. Con usted debe haber pasado lo mismo, ¿no? No me acuerdo. Váyase mucho al carajo. ¿Qué dice usted? Que ya estamos llegando, señor.
Thank you all. I want to take some questions, but first I want to say thank you to everybody. I shouldn't have to lean over. I'm a short person. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your expertise, for sharing your insights, for describing how Juan Rulfo has influenced your own work. And I love the detail and the specifics of each individual voice who spoke today. I thank you all. I hope our audience carries away a feeling of wanting to go read more of Juan Rulfo's work. Questions now. And if you have a question, please wait for a microphone to come to you so that the voice will carry. Questions from the audience. Back here on the right.
All right. One of the most powerful stories of Rulfo to me is No oyes ladrar los perros. And I bring this up because, as you spoke on the table, I would like to know your opinion about the relationship, the tragic relationship that Rulfo writes in all his stories about father and son. I'd like to see what you have to say about that.
That's a great question. I mean, especially because I've been thinking a lot about Pedro Páramo and the way that the impunity of his actions and the way that he kind of builds the world kind of relates a lot to kind of the way we live now here in the United States, right, with our current president and his family and so on, and how in Pedro Páramo the son mimics the father, and it's almost like tragic, right, because Pedro Paramo is a total asshole, right, and Miguel goes around like looking for women and raping women and pays somebody to get him women, and there's all this impunity that just continues and expands right through the family, right, and so as we it's the relationship between father and son, it's just an expansion of that the joke that we spend half our lives trying not to be like our parents and the other half being like our parents, and that there's that link between father and son that is just almost inescapable.
Another question?
In my reading of Rulfo's work, it seems to resonate very much with a particular historical context, the Cristero War, which is not very well known outside of Mexico. And I wonder if any of you could reflect or comment on the impact of that on Rulfo, both in his childhood, biographically, but also in the work, which is so steeped in a certain kind of violence that happened in Mexico, not just in Mexico, but other places too. Thank you.
Let me see. When I started reading Rulfo, that was very much the more orthodox version of, or at least the more orthodox interpretation of his work. That it was very much related to either the Mexican Revolution or a little bit later to the Cristero War, which is true. I mean, there are clear linkages that put together the world of both novels and short story and the context of Mexican history. But in this work that I did, the book that I wrote recently about that, I'm making an argument that is trying to expand that context. And after all, Rulfo wrote these works when he was already living in the city. The city was becoming this massive Mexico City that we now both suffer and enjoy. And part of my argument is that there is also a pretty strong influence of that urban life. The point of view, at least, of someone who is both suffering and enjoying this growing metropolis, and looking at the rural side as the rural life is being affected, deeply affected by processes of modernization that started right there in the mid-20th century. So I think it would be, to be in any case, it would be adding complexity to that first context of the Mexican Revolution, just to put together the major decisions that we as a nation made by the 21st century, most of them related to this process that we call modernization, and that essentially turned out to be, or whose main consequence has been the neglect of rural life in Mexico. So now, when I was writing the book and I organized some incursions in places and areas, regions of Mexico that Rulfo visited, at the beginning I thought that I was in fact doing some research about Mexico's past, and what I found out was that I was looking at Mexico's present, the consequences of those decisions made in the mid-20th century that we are now suffering in, just as Aura was mentioning, in terms of this massive, very serious and very sad violence that is invading the whole country.
There's another question down here. A microphone will be coming.
Thank you. I wonder if any of you have read Susan Sontag's introduction to the most recent American edition, and if so, have you any comments on it?
I love it. I think it's a great introduction, especially her mentioning of Garcia Marquez comments on Pedro Páramo. Apparently, Garcia Marquez, there were two books that influenced his work, and one was Pedro Páramo, and the other one was the Metamorphosis. And I think what is amazing about Susan Sontag is that she was so aware of the so-called Latin American boom, where it started, where it ended, and the importance of a book like that Pedro Páramo had in that role. That's a really great translation of I read that one. I got it for my wife to read mostly in English. Great comment by Susan. So, I mean, if any of you get that edition, I think just get it for the introductions. And the translation too. It's really good. I hope I.
Can I make a quick?
This is it. Yeah, with a nice surrealistic painting of Iftangi.
Oh, just a quick comment, right? Not surprising that Pedro Paramo is essentially a modernist novel, right? In the tradition of, in many ways, Faulkner. And so, she has great taste in these kind of modernist works, and that edition.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. That I think that maybe, as Cristina was saying, the first reading of Juan Rulfo was this context of the Cristero War and also the distribution of land after the revolution. But maybe, I think it's unfortunately, but also fortunately, Juan Rulfo's work is atemporal or beyond times. It's not adjust or fixed to that time or historical period, because some writers just become old because they are just subscribed to a specific period of history, and it's exactly what is not happening with Rulfo's work. Rulfo doesn't become old. We can read him nowadays and we could think that he's talking about Mexican actual reality. That is something like, I think that is a classic actually, that is the definition of classic. When you read Shakespeare, you could exactly think that he's talking about present time. And that's what happens with Rulfo.
Yeah, just an example of that. 2 weeks ago, a very brave Mexican journalist was killed in the northern state of Sonora. And it's not just a coincidence that many Mexicans in Twitter or Facebook or even in articles in different newspapers started to mention entire phrases by Juan Rulfo, Diles que no me maten, as Aura was reading earlier, was one of them. And I don't think that's just gratuitous. I mean, that there is a link. There is something that is still very alive, and the criticism over Mexican political life and social life, I think, is still very much present.
Then I forgot to mention that there is a long interview of Cristina Rivera Garza in this magazine too, that you can read about her book.
Wonderful. And you all have copies, right? Oh, some of you have copies. Another question back here? Somebody? More people want them. Okay. Alejandro. Microphone. We have to wait for the mic. This is all right.
And this is might be like a really hard question, Enrique, but if you were going to compare him with a painter, who would that painter be?
I will compare him more with the printmakers, with Posada, maybe, and with Francisco Aguilera Bustamante, who is the artist who did the engravings for the Portentosa Vida de la Muerte, the portentous life of death. That book was censored by the Spanish Inquisition because they say life and death cannot mix. You cannot say life of death. It's incorrect Spanish, so they censor the whole thing. There are hardly any copies left. There is one in Iago, the Library of Toledo in Oaxaca. There is some in the Library of the New York Public Library. I don't know how many copies are like that. But basically, that's, to me, a really good connection. Whoever makes a connection with life and death as a fuzzy line. I could end up with a joke about Pancho Villa, which is around the time of Pedro Páramo, which is reflects this. You know, there was this little kid who's selling a human skull to some tourist, and he goes, "Hey, mister, I'm selling you Pancho Villa's skull." And the tourist goes, "Wait a minute, you were selling us Pancho Villa's skull last year and it was bigger." And the kid goes, yes, but this is when he was a little kid." So that tells you about the life of death in Mexico, and it's very much rooted in many writers. The culture is there. I mean, the sense of humor over tragedies in Mexico is. I haven't seen anything like that hardly anywhere. You know, you could think of the earthquake in '85, and there were jokes after jokes after jokes. Like Plácido Domingo, my sister told me the first time I talked to her, they changed his name for Pinche Jueves. So, Plácido Domingo in Spanish means pleasant Sunday, and they changed his name to I would say like horrible Thursday, because that's when the earthquake took place on a Thursday. But I mean, and they love him because he went to help rescue people from the rubble. So even if they love you, you can't escape that. Disregard to death in a way, but also without necessarily bullying anybody. There is that sense of humor where it's in the arts, in the culture. And Rulfo, of course, reflects that, like masterfully.
Maybe we should stop here. What do you think? Anybody else have a comment? Oh, that's such a kind of wonderful, yes. The darkness happens and we can laugh. Yeah. Thank you all. There are books outside. You can look at Enrique's images. There are books to be signed by our authors as well. Thank you once again.
Thank you.